Welcome to one of the most unsettling cases recorded in history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the remote hills of the Ozark Mountains, nestled between the dense forests and rocky outcroppings of Shannon County, Missouri, stood the Holloway Estate, a once proud Victorian mansion built in 1867 by Nathaniel Holloway, a wealthy timber merchant who had made his fortune in the post-Civil War Reconstruction. By 1904, the mansion had fallen into a state of disrepair, much like the family name itself. The paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the ornate trim that had once been the envy of the county now hung loose and weathered. The Holloway family's decline mirrored that of their home, a slow, inexorable descent into obscurity, and as documents would later reveal, psychological deterioration. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely the deterioration of a once prominent family, but rather the peculiar circumstances surrounding their collective psychological breakdown. County records from 1904 indicate that within a span of just 6 months, all 4 adult members of the Holloway household were committed to the Missouri State Lunatic Asylum in Farmington. The official diagnosis: acute melancholia with delusional features. What the clinical terminology fails to capture, however, is the true horror of what transpired within those walls. According to the testimony of Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the family physician called to the Holloway Estate in April of 1904, the family patriarch, Thomas Holloway, was found in a catatonic state, staring at the wall of his study, muttering incomprehensibly about the eyes that follow. His wife, Eleanor, was discovered in the attic, having removed her own fingernails, apparently in an attempt to scrape away the colors that she claimed were seeping into her skin. Their adult son, William, and his wife, Margaret, were found, huddled in the root cellar, having not eaten for days, insisting that they could not return upstairs because it was watching them. The Holloway family had once been among the most respected in Shannon County. Thomas had inherited his father's timber business and expanded it considerably, investing in a sawmill operation near the town of Eminence that employed nearly 30 men. Eleanor came from the prominent Blackwood family of St. Louis, bringing both social connections and considerable wealth to the marriage. Their union was considered advantageous by both families, and for many years the Holloways were fixtures of the region's limited social scene, hosting the annual Harvest Ball and contributing generously to the construction of the county's first proper courthouse in 1889. Local newspaper archives contain numerous mentions of the family throughout the 1880s and 1890s, always in favorable terms. The Eminence Current noted in 1883 that Mr. Thomas Holloway's new steam-powered sawmill represents the very pinnacle of modern industry in our humble county. While the society pages regularly featured accounts of Eleanor's charitable work with the Ladies' Aid Society, William, their only son, was educated at Washington University in St. Louis, returning to Shannon County in 1901 with his new bride, Margaret, a doctor's daughter from Springfield. What precipitated the family's decline is difficult to pinpoint precisely. Business records from 1899 indicate that Thomas had begun to encounter financial difficulties, possibly related to increased competition from larger logging operations moving into the region from Arkansas. By 1902, he had been forced to sell off portions of his land holdings and reduce the workforce at his mill. The annual Harvest Ball was not held that year, nor in any year after, though no public announcement was made regarding its discontinuation. Elizabeth Parker, who served as a cook for the Holloway household from 1897 to 1903, provided a statement to the Shannon County Historical Society in 1935 describing the gradual change in the family's circumstances. It wasn't just the money troubles, she recalled. Plenty of families had those, and managed to maintain their dignity. There was something else, a kind of heaviness that seemed to settle over Mr. Thomas after his father passed in 1900. He became withdrawn, spending more and more time in his study with the door locked. Mrs. Eleanor tried to keep up appearances for a while, but eventually she too began to pull away from society. Parker noted that the household staff was gradually reduced from 8 domestic servants in 1900 to just herself and a groundskeeper by the end of 1903. Mrs. Eleanor said it was because of finances, but I always wondered. The house grew colder. Somehow, not just from lack of proper heating, there was a silence that seemed to grow deeper each month, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Parker left the Holloway employ in December of 1903, citing her own impending marriage as the reason, though she later confessed to finding the atmosphere of the house increasingly unsettling. It was into this atmosphere of quiet decline that the painting arrived in January of 1904. What connected the disturbing behaviors of the family members? A painting, not just any painting, but a particular oil portrait that hung in the main hall of the Holloway mansion. The subject of the painting remains a matter of dispute among the few existing accounts. What is known, based on the journal of Eleanor Holloway recovered in 1958 during a Historical Society cataloging project, is that the painting arrived at the estate in January of 1904, just 3 months before the family's commitment to the asylum. The journal entries, increasingly erratic and difficult to decipher, suggest that the painting was acquired by Thomas Holloway during a business trip to New Orleans. According to Eleanor's writings, Thomas had been invited to the home of a French quarter antiquities dealer named Marcel Davaux, who had apparently fallen on hard times and was liquidating his collection. It was there that Thomas encountered the painting, which Eleanor describes as a portrait of indeterminate origin, depicting a figure seated before a window, though the face is obscured by what appears to be either shadow or deliberate obfuscation by the artist. Thomas's business in New Orleans can be corroborated through other sources. The records of the Bank of Eminence show that he withdrew a significant sum of money on December 12, 1903, and train ticket receipts found among his papers confirm his departure for New Orleans on December 14th. He was ostensibly traveling to meet with potential investors for his struggling sawmill operation, though whether these meetings actually occurred remains unclear. What is certain is that he returned to Shannon County on January 3, 1904, bringing with him the painting that would eventually consume his family's sanity. Eleanor's journal provides the most detailed account of the painting's arrival and its initial impact on the household. Thomas returned from New Orleans much changed, she wrote on January 5th. There is a feverish quality to his movements, an intensity in his gaze that I have not seen in many years. He speaks little of his business, there saying only that he has made certain arrangements that will change everything. He brought with him a painting, which he has hung in the main hall without consulting me regarding its placement. It is not, to my taste, a rather somber portrait of a figure whose features I cannot quite discern. When I suggested it might be better suited to his study, he became uncharacteristically adamant that it remain where all can see it. What is particularly unsettling about Eleanor's description is her insistence that the painting shifts when observed from different angles, and that the subject's posture seems to alter subtly between viewings. Initially, she attributed these observations to tricks of the light or her own fatigue. However, as the weeks progressed, her journal entries become increasingly preoccupied with the painting, describing how the family found themselves drawn to it, spending hours in silent contemplation of what she refers to as the void where the face should be. By mid-January, Eleanor noted that Thomas had taken to sitting in the hall late into the night, staring at the painting. I woke at 3 this morning and found his side of the bed empty, she wrote on January 17th. When I went downstairs, he was seated in the armchair opposite the painting, utterly still, his eyes fixed upon it. A single lamp burned beside him, casting strange shadows across the canvas. I spoke his name 3 times before he responded, and when he finally turned to me, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when I did not recognize the expression on his face. It was as if someone else was looking out through his eyes. William and Margaret, who had maintained their own residence in Eminence, began to visit the estate more frequently during this period. Eleanor's journal mentions their increasing concern for Thomas's behavior, particularly his neglect of business matters. William attempted to discuss the state of the accounts today, she recorded on January 28th. But Thomas dismissed him with unusual sharpness, saying that material concerns no longer interested him. Later, I overheard William telling Margaret that his father seemed possessed by some idea that he refuses to articulate. Local records from the Ozark County Historical Society contain a curious notation in the form of a letter from Reverend James Hadley of the First Presbyterian Church of Winona to his superior in St. Louis, dated February 18, 1904. The letter mentions a visit to the Holloway Estate at Eleanor's request. The Reverend writes of being struck by the unusual atmosphere of the home and notes that the family seemed distracted and unwell. He specifically mentions being shown a painting that he found unremarkable in its execution, yet somehow disquieting. The Reverend declined Eleanor's request to bless the house, stating that he saw no evidence of spiritual malady, merely a family in need of rest and perhaps medical attention. What the Reverend's letter fails to mention, but which emerges from cross-referencing with Eleanor's journal, is that by this point William and Margaret had moved into the family estate permanently. Eleanor's entry from February 10th states, "William and Margaret have taken the east bedroom. Margaret says it is to be closer to us during this difficult time, but I suspect William does not entirely trust us to be alone with the painting. Not that he would admit as much. Indeed, he seems reluctant to discuss the painting at all, though I have seen him standing before it when he thinks no one is watching." By the end of February, Eleanor's journal entries had become increasingly fragmented and difficult to follow. She repeatedly referred to changes in the composition of the painting and claimed that the light from the window has begun to spill beyond the frame. On February 27th, she wrote, "I dreamed of the figure last night. It stood at the foot of our bed, still shrouded in that impossible shadow. It spoke, though I could see no mouth in the darkness where its face should be. It said that it had been waiting for us, that we are nearly ready." What happened in the weeks following the Reverend's visit can be pieced together from various sources. The Journal of Dr. Whitaker, which was donated to the University of Missouri Medical Archives in 1963, contains observations about his increasing concern for the Holloway family's mental state. He notes that by March, Thomas had begun to neglect his business affairs entirely, spending days at a time in the main hall, seated before the painting. Eleanor had taken to covering all the mirrors in the house with black cloth, claiming that she could see it reflected in them, even when the painting was not visible. Dr. Whitaker's first documented visit to the Holloway Estate in this period occurred on March 8, 1904, in response to a request from William, who reported that his father had not eaten or slept for 3 days. The doctor's notes describe finding Thomas in a state of extreme nervous excitement, pacing the main hall and muttering about the mathematics of perception and doors within doors. When questioned directly, Thomas insisted that he was perfectly well, but that he had made a discovery of profound importance while contemplating the painting. Mr. Holloway claimed, Dr. Whitaker wrote, that the artist had embedded a formula within the composition that, when properly understood, reveals aspects of reality normally hidden from human perception. When I suggested that perhaps he should rest and consider these ideas again when refreshed, he became agitated, insisting that there was no time for rest, as it is already beginning to come through. Dr. Whitaker prescribed a sedative and recommended that the family remove the painting from the house, suggesting that it had become a harmful fixation for Thomas. According to the doctor's notes, William agreed with this assessment, but confessed that his father had become irrationally protective of the artwork and reacted with hostility to any suggestion of its removal. The doctor departed with a promise to return in 2 days to check on Thomas's condition. When Dr. Whitaker returned on March 10th, he found the situation had deteriorated further. Eleanor, who had previously appeared merely anxious and fatigued, now exhibited signs of what the doctor termed nervous collapse. She refused to enter the main hall where the painting hung, claiming that she could feel its gaze even through walls. Most alarmingly, she had inflicted several deep scratches on her own arms, which she insisted was necessary to release the colors that were seeping into her skin. William and Margaret Holloway, who had previously lived in Springfield, but had moved into the family estate in February at Eleanor's insistence that she needed help with Thomas, began to exhibit similar behaviors. Margaret's letters to her sister in Kansas City, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, reveal a woman increasingly consumed by fear. "The portrait watches us at dinner," she wrote in early March. "William says I'm being fanciful, but I've seen him staring at it when he thinks no one is looking. There's something about the way the light hits the canvas. It seems to reveal different aspects of the subject. Sometimes I think I can see a smile where there was none before." Margaret's correspondence, which had previously been regular and detailed, became increasingly sporadic and disjointed throughout March. Her final letter, dated March 22nd, consists of a single paragraph. "I cannot write at length, as the light is poor and growing poorer. We have taken to keeping the curtains drawn at all times now. It helps, though not as much as we had hoped. William says we must stay, that we cannot abandon them to it. I am not certain he is still William. There are moments when he looks at me with an expression I have never seen before, as if trying to remember who I am. I have begun sleeping with a knife beneath my pillow. Not that it would help if what I fear comes to pass. How does one fight a shadow that spreads like ink through water?" By late March, the situation had deteriorated significantly, according to the testimony of Abigail Turner, the Holloway's housekeeper for over 20 years. The family had begun to seal off rooms in the house, claiming they could feel the painting's presence even when they were not in the main hall. Abigail's statement to the county sheriff, recorded on April 10, 1904, describes finding William Holloway attempting to brick up the entrance to the main hall using materials he had apparently transported from town himself. Abigail Turner, who had returned to the Holloway household in March at William's urgent request and with the offer of significantly increased wages, provided a detailed account of the family's deteriorating condition. According to her statement, the Holloways had established a complex set of rules governing their movements within the house. They would not pass directly from one room to another, she recalled, but would follow specific paths, often circuitous, as if avoiding something invisible. Mrs. Eleanor insisted that all doors be either fully open or fully closed, never ajar, and Mr. Thomas had taken to marking the thresholds with peculiar symbols drawn in charcoal. Most disturbing was Abigail's description of the family's behavior regarding the painting itself. None of them would look directly at it, she stated, but would approach it with their gaze averted, then turn suddenly as if hoping to catch it in some act. They spoke of it as if it were alive and aware, sometimes addressing remarks to it in hushed tones. Once I entered the hall to find all four of them standing in a semicircle before it, holding hands and swaying slightly like branches in a breeze, though the air was perfectly still. When questioned about his actions, William allegedly replied, "It needs to be contained. We can feel it spreading through the house. The brushstrokes are extending beyond the frame." Abigail left the employment of the Holloway family that same day, refusing to return to the estate. Dr. Whitaker, increasingly alarmed by the reports reaching him from Abigail Turner and others who had occasion to visit the Holloway estate, attempted to intervene once more on April 12th. His notes describe finding the house in a state of profound disorder and neglect. The once immaculate grounds were overgrown, and several windows had been boarded up from the inside. When he knocked at the front door, there was no response for several minutes, though he could hear movement within. Eventually, Margaret Holloway appeared looking, in the doctor's words, gaunt and unwashed, with a wild aspect to her eyes. She initially refused him entry, claiming that it was not safe for outsiders to enter the house. Only after considerable persuasion did she allow him into the foyer, though she blocked his access to the main hall where the painting hung. Dr. Whitaker's examination of Margaret revealed significant weight loss, elevated heart rate, and pupils, so dilated that her eyes appeared almost entirely black. When questioned about her health, she spoke in fragmented sentences about the light changing and the shadows moving when no one is watching. She repeatedly referred to Thomas as having gone ahead and claimed that Eleanor was halfway through already when the doctor asked to see the other family members. Margaret became agitated, insisting that they were not themselves at present. It was at this point that Dr. Whitaker heard Thomas Holloway's voice from deeper within the house, calling Margaret's name in what the doctor described as a tone of command unlike any I had previously heard from this normally mild-mannered individual. Margaret's reaction was immediate and disturbing. Her entire demeanor changed, Dr. Whitaker wrote. The fear in her eyes was replaced by something akin to resignation. She turned without another word and walked toward the sound of her father-in-law's voice, moving with the stiff, deliberate gait of a sleepwalker. I attempted to follow, but found my path blocked by William, who seemed to materialize from the shadows of the dining room. His appearance was even more alarming than his wife's, his clothing soiled, his beard untrimmed, and a peculiar vacancy in his expression. He informed me, in oddly formal language, that my presence was no longer required, and that the family was engaged in important work that must not be interrupted. When I expressed concern for their well-being, he smiled in a manner I can only describe as chilling and said, "We have never been better, Doctor. We are approaching completion." Deeply troubled by this encounter, Dr. Whitaker consulted with Sheriff Clarence Dawson regarding the possibility of removing the Holloways from their home for their own protection. While the sheriff was initially reluctant to intervene in what he viewed as a private family matter, the doctor's account, combined with the increasingly disturbing reports circulating in the community, convinced him of the necessity for action. It was on April 15, 1904, that Dr. Whitaker, accompanied by Sheriff Clarence Dawson, made the decision to forcibly remove the Holloway family from their home and transport them to the asylum in Farmington. The doctor's notes describe a scene of profound disarray. The mansion, once meticulously maintained despite its age, was found in a state of squalor. Rotting food sat untouched in the kitchen, and evidence suggested that none of the family members had bathed or changed their clothing for several weeks. The sheriff's official report provides a clinical account of what they discovered upon entering the house. The front door was unlocked but barricaded from within by a heavy sideboard, which required considerable effort to move. The interior was in a state of severe disorder, with furniture overturned and personal effects scattered throughout. Most of the windows had been covered with heavy fabric, creating an unnatural darkness even at midday. The air was stale and carried an unpleasant odor suggestive of unwashed bodies and spoiled food. The family members were found in various locations throughout the house. Eleanor was discovered in the attic, surrounded by piles of cloth into which she had sewn intricate patterns using her own hair as thread. She offered no resistance when approached, but seemed unaware of the officer's presence, continuing to sew and mutter to herself about binding the seams between worlds. William and Margaret were located in the root cellar, huddled together, in a corner surrounded by a circle of candles. According to the sheriff's report, they appeared severely malnourished and dehydrated, with cracked lips and sunken eyes. When light was shone upon them, they reacted with extreme distress, covering their faces and crying out that it would find them more easily in the light. Most disturbing, however, was the discovery made in Thomas Holloway's study. The walls, once adorned with hunting trophies and family photographs, had been covered with hundreds of sketches, apparently drawn by Thomas himself. Each sketch depicted the same subject, a crude approximation of the painting's composition, but with subtle variations in the position of the seated figure. In some drawings, the figure's head was turned slightly toward the viewer. In others, a hand was raised where no hand had been before. Sheriff Dawson's official report notes that Thomas had apparently used his own blood as pigment for some of the later sketches, as evidenced by self-inflicted wounds on his forearms. Thomas himself was found in the main hall, seated before the painting in a state that Dr. Whitaker described as cataleptic. He did not respond to verbal stimuli and showed no reaction when physically moved from his chair. His eyes remained fixed on the canvas, though the doctor noted that they did not appear to be focusing properly, with the pupils contracted to pinpoints despite the dimness of the room. The painting itself remained hanging in the main hall, described by Sheriff Dawson as a rather unremarkable portrait of a person seated by a window, the face cast in shadow. He noted that he could not fathom how such a bland piece of art could inspire such obsession. Dr. Whitaker, however, in a private letter to a colleague at the asylum, confessed to feeling a strange reluctance to gaze upon the canvas for too long, and admitted to an inexplicable sense of relief upon leaving the Holloway estate. One detail that appears in both the sheriff's report and Dr. Whitaker's notes, but which was not included in the official documentation submitted to the court, concerns the condition of the main hall itself. According to these private accounts, these walls of the hall had been covered with the same strange symbols that Abigail Turner had mentioned seeing Thomas draw on the thresholds. These markings, executed in what appeared to be charcoal, formed concentric circles radiating outward from the painting, covering the ceiling and floor as well as the walls. Most peculiar, however, was the sheriff's observation regarding the physical condition of the painting. Upon closer inspection, he wrote in his personal journal, though not in his official report, I noted that the canvas appeared to be under some kind of tension, as if the surface were being pushed outward from behind. The frame showed signs of stress, with small cracks appearing at the joints. When I mentioned this to Dr. Whitaker, suggesting that perhaps the canvas had been improperly stretched, he examined it briefly and agreed that there was something unusual about its appearance, though he could not specify what. The removal of the Holloway family from their home was accomplished with surprisingly little resistance. Eleanor, William, and Margaret were too weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion to oppose the sheriff and his deputies. Thomas remained in his catatonic state and had to be carried from the house on a stretcher. All four were transported directly to the Missouri State Lunatic Asylum in Farmington, where they were admitted under the diagnosis of shared psychotic disorder with severe delusional features. Following the family's commitment to the asylum, the Holloway estate remained vacant. Thomas's brother, Edward Holloway, a banker from St. Louis, was appointed executor of the family's affairs, but showed little interest in the property itself. According to county records, he arranged for most of the valuable furnishings to be auctioned off in July of 1904, with the proceeds established as a trust to provide for the family's care at the asylum. Curiously, the inventory list from this auction, preserved in the Shannon County Courthouse archives, makes no mention of the painting that had so consumed the family's attention. When questioned about this omission in 1957 by local historian Margaret Winters, Edward's son, Frederick, claimed that his father had specifically instructed the auctioneers to destroy the painting, though he could not recall the reason for this directive. A letter from Edward Holloway to the auction house dated June 28, 1904, provides some insight into his decision regarding the painting. With respect to the oil portrait hanging in the main hall, he wrote, "This item is not to be included in the catalogue. It is my wish that it be removed from its frame and burned. The frame itself, being of good quality walnut, may be sold separately." I understand that this request may seem unusual, but I have my reasons, which I do not care to elaborate upon in writing. Whether this instruction was carried out remains a matter of debate. The receipt from the auction house confirms that the frame was indeed sold, fetching a respectable sum of $8. However, there is no documentation regarding the disposal of the canvas itself. A note in the margin of the auction house's copy of Edward's letter, discovered during a review of their archives in 1960, read simply, "Canvas removed as directed. J.H. reluctant to destroy, claims artistic merit. Matter left unresolved." The asylum records for the Holloway family present a bleak narrative. Thomas died within 6 months of his commitment, with the official cause listed as failure to thrive. Eleanor survived until 1906, but never regained lucidity. According to her treatment notes, she spent her days creating intricate patterns with colored threads on the walls of her room, patterns that the attending physician described as reminiscent of certain schools of abstract art, though created by a mind with no formal artistic training. Dr. Alden Morris, the chief psychiatrist at the Farmington Asylum from 1903 to 1912, took a particular interest in the Holloway case. His detailed notes, preserved in the asylum's archives, provide valuable insight into the progression of the family's condition during their institutionalization. Of Thomas, he wrote, "The patient remains primarily non-responsive, though he occasionally exhibits periods of extreme agitation during which he attempts to draw on any available surface. These drawings invariably depict the same subject, a seated figure with an indistinct face. Patient becomes distressed when these drawings are removed and must be sedated." Eleanor's condition, according to Dr. Morris, followed a different trajectory. Initially withdrawn and uncommunicative, she gradually developed what the doctor termed an elaborate symbolic language expressed through her thread work. "Mrs. Holloway has transformed her room into a kind of three-dimensional web," he noted in August of 1905. The threads which she obtains by unraveling her clothing and bedding are arranged in patterns of remarkable complexity. When questioned about their purpose, she replies only that she is sealing the cracks and binding what wishes to be unbound. Despite the obvious manifestation of delusional thinking, there is a certain mathematical precision to her work that suggests an underlying logic, however distorted. William and Margaret Holloway fared somewhat better. After 18 months of treatment, including the then experimental technique of hydrotherapy, William was deemed sufficiently recovered to be released into the care of his uncle Edward. Margaret remained institutionalized until 1909, when she, too, was released. The couple never returned to the Ozarks, instead relocating to California, where William found work as a clerk in a San Francisco shipping firm. Dr. Morris's notes indicate that William's recovery was marked by a complete denial of the events leading to his institutionalization. Patient now claims to have no memory of the period immediately preceding his commitment, the doctor wrote in October of 1905. When shown the sketches produced by his father, he exhibits no recognition and expresses appropriate concern regarding the mental state they suggest. Either the amnesia is genuine, which would be unusual in a case of shared psychosis, or Mr. Holloway has made a conscious decision to reject his delusions, which bodes well for his recovery. Margaret's case proved more challenging. Unlike William, She retained vivid memories of the events at the Holloway Estate, but came to interpret them differently. Dr. Morris recorded that by 1907 she had developed what he called a protective framework of rationalization, out attributing the family's breakdown to carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heating stoves in the old mansion. Mrs. Holloway now speaks of hallucinations and group hysteria. He noted, "She has constructed an explanation that allows her to acknowledge the events while denying their supernatural implications. While not entirely consistent with the facts of the case, this narrative has enabled her to distance herself from the terror she previously experienced, which I consider therapeutic." Progress. What makes their case particularly intriguing is a letter written by William to Dr. Whitaker in 1912, discovered among the doctor's personal effects after his death in 1931. In this correspondence, William thanks the doctor for his care and reports that both he and Margaret are well and living quietly. However, he also confesses that the memory of those months in the house with the painting remains vivid, and that he still sometimes wakes in the night, convinced that he can see that same quality of light that emanated from the canvas. The letter suggests that William's apparent recovery may have been more a matter of suppression than genuine resolution. "I have not spoken of these things to Margaret," he wrote, "as she has found her own way to live with what happened. She tells herself, and perhaps truly believes, that we were all made ill by coal gas or some toxin in the well water. It is a reasonable explanation, one that the world would readily accept, and I see no benefit in challenging it. But you and I, Doctor, know that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation." Most tellingly, William writes, "I have not picked up a brush nor visited a gallery since our release. Margaret and I keep no artwork in our home, not even photographs. Some might find this extreme, but we have learned that there are certain things that, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some visions imprint themselves upon the mind in ways that defy rational explanation. The Holloway estate itself remained abandoned for decades, falling further into disrepair. Local legends began to circulate about the house being haunted, though these tales bore little resemblance to the documented facts of the case. In 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, a fire of unknown origin destroyed much of the structure, leaving only the stone foundation and chimney standing as testament to its existence. The fire, according to the report filed by the Shannon County Sheriff's Department, was discovered in the early hours of October 17, 1932, by a local farmer named Joseph Harkins, who was passing the property on his way to town. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived from Eminence, the mansion was fully engulfed, with flames visible from over a mile away. Given the isolated location and the structure's abandoned state, no attempt was made to save the building, with efforts focused instead on preventing the fire from spreading to the surrounding forest. The official cause was listed as undetermined, though the report notes that transient activity had been observed in the area, suggesting that the fire might have been accidentally set by vagrants seeking shelter. However, a curious detail emerges from the statement provided by Harkins. He claimed that before noticing the flames, his attention had been drawn to the property by an unusual quality of light emanating from the windows of the main hall, which he initially mistook for moonlight, reflecting off glass, though the night was cloudy. Even more peculiar is Harkins's description of the fire itself. "It didn't burn like a normal house fire," he told the sheriff. "The flames were too steady, almost like liquid flowing up instead of flickering, and the color wasn't right. There was a yellowish cast to it that I've never seen before or since. Strangest of all, there was hardly any smoke, just that bright, steady burning, like the house wanted to burn." Interest in the Holloway case might have faded entirely were it not for the discovery made in 1958 by Dr. Lawrence Pritchard, a psychiatrist researching the history of mental health treatment in Missouri. While examining archived patient records from the Farmington Asylum, Dr. Pritchard came across the Holloway family case files. Intrigued by the unusual nature of their shared delusion, he began to investigate further, eventually locating Eleanor's journal and connecting it with other historical documents related to the family. Pritchard's research notes, preserved in the University of Missouri archives, reveal a methodical attempt to reconstruct the events of 1904. The Holloway case represents a fascinating example of folie à famille, he wrote, but with certain anomalous features that resist conventional psychiatric explanation. The rapidity of onset, the consistency of the delusions across all four family members, and the specific fixation on a single object as the source of their distress. All these factors suggest a phenomenon more complex than typical shared psychosis. What particularly intrigued Pritchard was the painting itself and its possible role in triggering the family's breakdown. If we accept for the sake of argument that the painting was the proximate cause of the Holloway's condition, he speculated, then we must consider what properties it might have possessed that could induce such profound psychological effects. The descriptions provided by Eleanor Holloway and others suggest a work that somehow disrupted normal perceptual processes, creating a state of cognitive dissonance that the mind struggled to resolve. Dr. Pritchard's research led him to track down Margaret Holloway, who at the age of 83 was living in a nursing home in Pasadena. Although initially reluctant to discuss her experiences, Margaret eventually agreed to a series of interviews with Dr. Pritchard in 1959. The transcripts of these conversations, published in a limited academic journal in 1962, provide the most comprehensive first-hand account of the events at the Holloway Estate. According to Margaret, the painting's effect on the family was gradual, but inexorable. At first, she recalled, it was simply a matter of finding oneself standing before it, not quite remembering having decided to go look at it. Thomas would joke about it, saying, "The artist must have captured something essential about human curiosity." But then we began to notice other things. Margaret described how the family began to experience visual disturbances when looking at the painting. The proportions seemed wrong somehow, as if the perspective was calculated using mathematics different from those that govern our world. The window behind the figure appeared to show a landscape that couldn't possibly exist outside the house, a vista of strange, angular formations that Eleanor insisted resembled the mountains visible from her childhood home in Vermont, though she hadn't been there in 40 years. Most disturbing were Margaret's descriptions of the figure in the painting itself. The face was always in shadow, that much is true, but the shadow seemed to move, to deepen or recede, depending on who was viewing the painting and when. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I could see features forming in that darkness, a suggestion of eyes, the curve of what might be a smile. But when I looked directly, there was only the void. According to Margaret, the family's obsession with the painting intensified after they discovered a signature hidden in the lower right corner of the canvas. It wasn't a name, but a symbol, sort of spiral with small marks radiating from it. Thomas became convinced that it was some sort of code or mathematical formula. He spent days in his study attempting to decipher it, covering pages with calculations and diagrams that made less and less sense as time went on. By March, Margaret claimed the family had begun to experience what she termed bleed-through, moments when elements of the painting seemed to manifest in their physical environment. The quality of light would change in a room, taking on the same sickly yellow cast as the light in the painted window. We would catch glimpses of movement where there should be none, always in our peripheral vision. The house began to feel larger somehow, as if additional spaces were opening up within. Spaces that corresponded to whatever impossible landscape was depicted beyond that painted window. Dr. Pritchard's notes indicate that he initially approached Margaret's account with professional skepticism, attributing her vivid descriptions to the persistence of delusional thinking despite her apparent recovery. However, as the interviews progressed, he found himself increasingly troubled by the consistency and conviction with which she recounted her experiences. Mrs. Holloway speaks not as one recalling a delusion, he observed, but as one who has witnessed something beyond her capacity to explain. There is a quality of resigned acceptance in her narrative that is distinct from the defensive rationalization typically seen in recovered psychotics. Margaret's most chilling recollection concerned the night of April 3rd, approximately 2 weeks before the family was removed to the asylum. I woke to find William gone from our bed. I searched the house and eventually found him in the main hall, standing before the painting. The moon was full that night, and its light came through the windows, illuminating the canvas in a way I hadn't seen before. William was perfectly still, his hand outstretched toward the painting, not quite touching it. When I called his name, he turned to me, and his face. Here, according to Dr. Pritchard's notes, Margaret became too distressed to continue for several minutes. When she resumed her account, it was with noticeable reluctance. His face was wrong, the proportions, the features. They weren't William's, or rather, they were his, but somehow rearranged, as if someone with only a passing familiarity with human anatomy had attempted to reconstruct him. And his eyes. They were dark, entirely dark, like the shadow that obscured the face in the painting. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He said, "It's showing me the way out, Margaret. There are doors we never knew existed." Margaret claimed that she fled the house that night, running barefoot through the woods to the nearest neighbor, a farm nearly 2 miles distant. By the time she returned with help the following morning, William had no memory of the incident and insisted that Margaret must have had a nightmare. "But I knew what I had seen," she told Dr. Pritchard, "and I think deep down so did he. That was when we began to plan our escape from the house. But somehow we never quite managed to leave. Each day we would pack a few belongings, make arrangements, set a time to depart, and each day we would find ourselves still there when night fell, with no clear memory of why we had decided to delay." The neighbor to whom Margaret fled that night, a farmer named Harold Jenkins, was still alive in 1959, though elderly and in poor health. Dr. Pritchard managed to locate and interview him, seeking corroboration of Margaret's account. Jenkins's recollection, while less detailed due to the passage of time, largely supported her story. "I remember that night clear enough," he told Pritchard. "Must have been around 2 in the morning when she came pounding on our door, half-dressed, and with bleeding feet from running through the woods. My wife got her calmed down enough to tell us something was wrong with her husband, though she wouldn't say exactly what. I hitched up the wagon and took her back to the Holloway place, bringing my shotgun along just in case," Jenkins recalled. Finding William Holloway in bed, apparently asleep with no sign of anything amiss. He seemed mighty confused when we woke him, had no idea why his wife would have run off like that. I figured she must have had a bad dream or maybe sleepwalked herself. But I'll tell you this, I didn't care for the feel of that house, not one bit. There was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was glad enough to leave once I was sure there wasn't any immediate danger. What Jenkins did not tell Dr. Pritchard, but later confided to his own son, who subsequently shared the information with researchers in 1978, was that while in the Holloway house that night, he had glimpsed the painting in the main hall. Pa said he only saw it for a moment as they passed through, Robert Jenkins recalled. But that moment was enough to give him nightmares for weeks afterward. He said there was something about it that wasn't right, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. He did say that when he glanced at it, he could have sworn the figure in the painting turned its head slightly, as if to look at him. Pa wasn't a fanciful man, so for him to say something like that, well, it made an impression on me. Dr. Pritchard noted that while Margaret's account contained elements that could be attributed to delusional thinking, certain details aligned too. Precisely with the independent documentation, Eleanor's journal, Dr. Whitaker's notes, the sheriff's report, to be dismissed entirely. Additionally, Margaret's recollections remained consistent across multiple interviews conducted over several months, with no evidence of the narrative embellishment typically seen in fabricated accounts. During their final interview, Margaret shared with Dr. Pritchard a detail she had previously withheld. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, "something I've never told anyone, not even William. The night before, Dr. Whitaker and the sheriff came to take us away. I went to the main hall. I don't know why. It was as if something was calling me. Thomas was there, sitting in his usual place before the painting, though he didn't acknowledge my presence. I stood beside him and made myself look directly at the canvas, really look, for the first time in weeks. What she saw, she claimed, defied rational description. The figure in the chair was still there, still shrouded in shadow, but the window behind it, the window showed this room, the main hall of the Holloway house, viewed from an impossible angle, as if the painting hung on a wall we couldn't see. And there was Thomas, seated in his chair, staring at the painting, and beside him a woman who was both me and not me, with her face twisted in an expression of dawning horror. Margaret told Dr. Pritchard that she had no memory of what happened immediately after this moment. The next thing I knew, I was in the root cellar with William, surrounded by candles. I didn't tell him what I had seen. I couldn't bring myself to articulate it. But I think that's when I understood that whatever was happening to us, it wasn't merely madness. It was something else entirely, something for which we have no adequate vocabulary. Perhaps most intriguing is what happened after Dr. Pritchard concluded his research. According to his colleagues at the University of Missouri, he became increasingly preoccupied with locating the painting itself. His notes from this period, preserved in the university archives, show a methodical attempt to trace the provenance of the artwork, beginning with the enigmatic Marcel Deveau in New Orleans. Dr. Pritchard's investigation led him to evidence that Deveau had acquired the painting from the estate sale of a reclusive mathematician named Victor Arnault, who had passed away under mysterious circumstances in 1891. Arnault's journals, portions of which Pritchard managed to obtain from a private collector, contained references to experiments in what he termed non-Euclidean visualization, attempts to represent four-dimensional structures within the constraints of a two-dimensional medium. One passage from Arnault's journal, dated December 3, 1890, seems particularly relevant. "I believe I have finally achieved a partial success in my endeavor. By employing certain mathematical principles in the arrangement of perspective, color, and proportion, I have created a visual field that appears to extend beyond the confines of the canvas. The effect is subtle but unmistakable, a suggestion of depth that corresponds to no physical space, a window opening onto dimensions normally inaccessible to human perception. The implications are profound, and I must confess, somewhat disturbing. What if such a window, once opened, permits traffic in both directions?" Arnault's final journal entry, written the day before his death, consists of a single sentence. "It is watching me through my own eyes." The coroner's report on Arnault's death notes that he was found in his study facing a blank wall from which, according to the housekeeper's statement, a painting had recently been removed. The housekeeper, Marie Fonteau, told authorities that Arnault had instructed her to take the painting to Marcel Deveau's antiquities shop in the French Quarter, claiming that he could no longer bear to have it in his home. He said it was no longer his work, she recalled, that it had become something else, something he did not recognize. In his final published paper on the subject, presented at a psychiatric conference in 1964, Dr. Pritchard proposed that the Holloway family may have fallen victim to a form of shared psychosis triggered by prolonged exposure to the painting, which he theorized might have employed unusual visual techniques designed to create perceptual disturbances. He compared the effect to certain optical illusions known to induce discomfort or vertigo, but operating on a more profound neurological level. "The human brain," he wrote, has evolved to interpret visual information according to certain rules and expectations. When these rules are deliberately subverted through unusual perspective, impossible geometries, or other techniques that create cognitive dissonance, the result can be profound psychological distress. In severe cases, and particularly in individuals already predisposed to mental instability, such distress might manifest as delusional thinking or even psychosis. Pritchard suggested that Victor Arnault, whether intentionally or accidentally, might have created a work of art that exploited this vulnerability in human perception. The mathematical principles referenced in Arnault's journals, he proposed, may have enabled him to create visual patterns that the brain cannot properly resolve, leading to a state of perpetual cognitive conflict that, over time, could destabilize an individual's entire perceptual framework. The academic community largely dismissed Pritchard's theories as speculative. What is not in dispute, however, is that in September of 1964, Dr. Pritchard traveled to New Orleans to follow up on a lead regarding the possible location of the painting. He never returned. According to police reports, his hotel room was found, undisturbed, with his luggage unpacked and his notes arranged neatly on the desk. The only item missing was his camera, which he had reportedly brought to photograph any artifacts he might discover. The New Orleans police concluded that Pritchard had likely met with foul play while exploring some of the city's less reputable neighborhoods in pursuit of his research. The case was never solved, and no trace of him was ever found. A colleague of Pritchard's at the University of Missouri, Dr. Rebecca Collins, attempted to continue his research after his disappearance. Her notes, donated to the university archives upon her retirement in 1978, reveal that she managed to locate and interview an elderly woman named Claudette Devaux, the daughter of Marcel Devaux, the antiquities dealer who had sold the painting to Thomas Holloway. According to Collins's transcript of the interview, Claudette recalled the painting clearly, despite the passage of 6 decades. "It was not like my father's usual inventory," she stated. "He typically dealt in conventional antiques, furniture, silver, the occasional portrait of a plantation owner or his wife. This painting was different, modern almost, though not in any style I recognized. My father kept it in a back room, not on display with the other artworks. When I asked him about it, he said it was not for sale to just anyone, that he was waiting for the right buyer. He seemed almost relieved when Mr. Holloway expressed interest in it." Claudette's most disturbing recollection concerned the painting's effect on her father. After he acquired it from the Arnault estate, he changed. He became distracted, irritable. "I would find him in the storeroom at odd hours, standing before the painting with a peculiar expression on his face. Once I heard him speaking to it in a low voice, though I couldn't make out the words. When Mr. Holloway purchased it, Papa seemed to recover his old self almost immediately. It was as if a weight had been lifted from him. He never spoke of the painting again, not once in all the years before his death." In 1968, a graduate student named Jennifer Keene, researching the history of the Ozarks for her doctoral dissertation, came across references to the Holloway case in county archives. Intrigued, she began to compile the various documents related to the family and their strange obsession. Her work led her to the transcript of Margaret Holloway's interviews with Dr. Pritchard and eventually to Pritchard's own disappearance. Keene's thesis advisor cautioned her against becoming too immersed in what he termed a historical curiosity of minimal academic value. Nevertheless, she persisted in her research, even traveling to California to attempt to locate any surviving relatives of William and Margaret Holloway, who might provide additional information. It was during this investigation that Keene made a discovery that casts the entire case in an even more disturbing light. In the archives of a small art museum in Berkeley, she found a catalog from an exhibition of visionary American folk art held in 1923. Among the works listed was an oil painting titled simply interior, attributed to an anonymous artist. The brief description reads, "Oil on canvas, circa 1880 to 1890, depicts a seated figure by a window, face obscured by shadow. Notable for unusual perspective effects and distinctive use of light." The catalog indicated that the painting had been donated to the museum by a private collector named Richard Holloway, William and Margaret's son, born in 1912, 3 years after Margaret's release from the asylum. According to museum records, the painting was displayed briefly, but was removed from exhibition after several visitors complained of eye strain and discomfort when viewing it. It was placed in storage and apparently forgotten until the compilation of the catalog. How Richard Holloway came to possess the painting that had so devastated his parents remains a mystery. Margaret, in her interviews with Dr. Pritchard, never mentioned her son having any connection to the artwork, and indeed seemed unaware that it still existed. One possibility suggested by Keene in her dissertation is that Richard might have sought out the painting deliberately, perhaps driven by stories he had heard about his family's past. The psychological literature, Keene wrote, contains numerous examples of individuals compulsively returning to the sources of childhood trauma, seeking to understand or master experiences that shape their development. If Richard Holloway grew up hearing even fragmentary accounts of what happened to his parents in 1904, he might have developed a fixation on the painting as the key to understanding his family's history. Keene immediately requested access to the museum's storage facility to examine the painting. Her request was granted, but when museum staff attempted to locate the work, it could not be found. A subsequent inventory confirmed that it was missing, with no record of it having been loaned, sold, or otherwise removed from the collection. The museum's registrar, in a memo dated April 1968, speculated that the painting might have been misplaced during a renovation of the storage facilities in 1956, or possibly deaccessioned without proper documentation during a period of administrative turnover in the early 1960s. Given the undistinguished nature of the work, the memo concluded, its absence is regrettable from a procedural standpoint, but not a significant loss to the collection. In her thesis, completed in 1969, Keene speculates that Richard Holloway may have reclaimed the painting at some point, though she found no documentation to support this theory. What she did discover, however, was that Richard Holloway had been committed to a psychiatric facility in Oakland in 1939, diagnosed with acute paranoid disorder characterized by persistent visual hallucinations. He remained institutionalized until his death in 1957. The medical records, which Keene was able to access through a colleague at the University of California, contain a psychiatrist's note that Richard repeatedly expresses fear of an unnamed painting, which he claims contains a doorway through which something is attempting to enter our world. The psychiatrist attributed these fears to Richard having heard stories about his parents' psychiatric history during his formative years. More disturbing, however, is a detail found in the admission notes from Richard's initial evaluation. The examining physician recorded that Richard was brought to the hospital by police after being found in the Berkeley Museum after hours, having apparently hidden inside until closing. He was discovered in the storage area in a highly agitated state, attempting to damage a painting with a pocket knife. The report does not identify the specific artwork, noting only that it was a dark interior scene that the patient claimed was looking back at him. Keene's thesis, titled Perception and Delusion, the Holloway Family Case as Cultural Artifact, received little attention outside of academic circles. However, it did attract the interest of Dr. Helen Morris, a neurologist specializing in visual processing disorders. Dr. Morris contacted Keene in early 1970 to discuss the possibility of the Holloway painting having employed some unknown technique that might trigger anomalous neurological responses. In correspondence preserved in Keene's papers, Dr. Morris proposed a theory that certain visual stimuli might create what she termed perceptual feedback loops in the brain's visual processing centers. Under normal circumstances, she wrote, the brain receives visual information, interprets it according to established patterns, and creates a coherent image of reality. However, it is theoretically possible to create visual compositions that confound this process. Images that the brain continually attempts to resolve but cannot, creating a state of perpetual cognitive conflict. Morris suggested that such conflict, experienced over extended periods, might induce neurological effects similar to those seen in certain forms of sensory deprivation or overstimulation. The brain, unable to properly categorize and process what it is seeing, might begin to generate anomalous perceptions as it struggles to impose order on visual information that defies its interpretive frameworks. In susceptible individuals, this could potentially manifest as hallucinations, delusions, or other symptoms typically associated with psychosis. According to correspondence preserved in Keene's papers, donated to the University of Arkansas archives after her death in 2012, she and Dr. Morris planned to collaborate on further research into the case. However, this collaboration was cut short when Keene was involved in an automobile accident on Highway 65 near Branson, Missouri, while returning from a research trip to the site of the former Holloway Estate in April 1970. Police reports indicate that Keene's vehicle inexplicably veered off the road and down a steep embankment, despite good weather conditions and no evidence of mechanical failure. The investigating officer noted that there were no skid marks indicating an attempt to brake, suggesting that Keene may have experienced a medical emergency while driving. Among her personal effects recovered from the vehicle was a camera containing exposed film, which was damaged beyond recovery in the accident. A curious footnote to this tragedy emerged several years later when a highway maintenance worker discovered a notebook in the underbrush near the site of Keene's accident. The notebook, presumed to be hers, contained primarily routine research notes, but the final entry, dated the day of the crash, has provoked speculation. It reads simply, "Returning from H site, strange light in the trees just before sunset." Reminiscent of MH's description of the window light. Took several photographs. Must consult with Dr. M regarding possible explanations. Dr. Morris continued her interest in the case independently, publishing a paper in 1972 in the Journal of Neurological Phenomena titled Theoretical Mechanisms for Visually Induced Psychological Distress, the Holloway Case Study. In this article, she proposed that certain combinations of visual elements, perspective, color, contrast, and composition, might create patterns that the human brain interprets as threatening or impossible, triggering profound anxiety responses. Morris speculated that the Holloway painting might have accidentally achieved such an effect through unconventional artistic techniques, possibly derived from the mathematical experiments of Victor Arnault. She compared the reported effects to more common visual phenomena, such as the discomfort induced by viewing moire patterns or certain types of optical illusions, but operating at a deeper level of visual processing. Consider the example of the Penrose triangle, she wrote, a figure that appears to be a solid three-dimensional object, despite being an impossible structure that could not exist in our three-dimensional space. When viewing such an image, the brain experiences a conflict between its understanding of spatial relationships and the visual information it is receiving. This conflict is typically resolved by recognizing the image as an illusion. But what if an artwork were constructed in such a way that this conflict could not be so easily resolved? What if it presented the viewer with a visual paradox that the brain could neither accept as real nor dismiss as illusion? The paper attracted little attention at the time, dismissed by many of Morris's colleagues as overly speculative. However, it has gained renewed interest in recent decades among researchers studying the psychological impacts of visual stimuli, particularly in the context of virtual reality environments, where users occasionally report unexplained anxiety or disorientation when exposed to certain visual configurations. In 1975, the last significant development in the Holloway case occurred when a private collector named James Martindale contacted the University of Missouri, claiming to have acquired a painting that matched the description of the Holloway portrait. Martindale, who specialized in obscure American art, said he had purchased the piece at an estate sale in San Francisco and had become intrigued by the unusual signature, a spiral with radiating marks, hidden in the corner of the canvas. Dr. Edward Browning, who had taken over curation of Dr. Pritchard's research materials after his disappearance, arranged to view the painting at Martindale's home in Chicago. In a memo to the university's Department of Psychology, dated June 15, 1975, Browning reported that the painting was undoubtedly similar to the descriptions in the Holloway case files, depicting a seated figure before a window, the face obscured by a shadow. Browning's description of the painting provides additional details not found in earlier accounts. The work is executed in oils on a canvas approximately 24 for 36 inches, he wrote. The composition is dominated by a figure seated in what appears to be a high-backed chair, positioned before a window that occupies most of the right side of the canvas. The figure itself is rendered in dark tones with the face entirely in shadow, making it impossible to discern features, age, or even gender. The window shows a landscape that is difficult to identify, a series of angular formations that might be mountains or architectural structures, rendered in an unusually luminous yellow ochre that contrasts sharply with the darker interior. Browning noted, however, that he found the work technically accomplished but otherwise unremarkable, with none of the disorienting effects reported by the Holloway family or suggested in Dr. Morris's theoretical framework. He concluded that it was likely a similar painting by the same artist, rather than the specific work that had affected the Holloways. Martindale, disappointed by this assessment, nevertheless offered to donate the painting to the university for further study. Browning declined, suggesting that without definitive provenance linking it to the Holloway case, the painting was of limited academic interest. According to Browning's notes, Martindale seemed relieved by this decision, confessing that despite his initial enthusiasm, he had come to find the painting somewhat unsettling and had recently moved it from his bedroom to his study after experiencing unusually vivid nightmares. In a private letter to a colleague discovered after his retirement, Browning admitted to certain reservations about his examination of the painting. "While I stand by my official assessment," he wrote, "I must confess that there was something about the work that I found oddly disturbing. The perspective seemed somehow off, though I could not precisely identify how. And there was a peculiar quality to the light depicted as coming through the window, a sort of visual dissonance that created a mild but persistent sense of unease. I found myself reluctant to look at it for extended periods, which I attributed at the time to eye strain. In retrospect, I wonder if there might have been more to Martindale's concerns than I initially credited." The correspondence between Browning and Martindale ended abruptly in August of 1975. Browning's final memo on the matter, found in the university archives, mentions an unexpected phone call from Martindale in which the collector reportedly sounded agitated and sleep-deprived, insisting that the painting had changed and that he could now see something forming in the shadows where the face should be. Browning suggested that Martindale consult a physician for what he presumed was an anxiety condition. No further communication from Martindale appears in the records. A handwritten note by Browning, dated October 1975, indicates that he attempted to contact Martindale by telephone, but was informed by a relative that he had gone on an extended trip abroad and was not expected to return for some time. The painting's current whereabouts, assuming it still exists, remain unknown. An inquiry by the Chicago Tribune in 1982, as part of a feature on local art collectors, revealed that Martindale's extended trip had become permanent. According to his sister, interviewed for the article, Martindale had abruptly sold his Chicago home and most of his possessions in September 1975, using the proceeds to purchase a remote property in northern Maine. He said he needed solitude, she told the reporter. The last letter I received from him, dated around Christmas of '75, mentioned something about continuing the work that Arno began. I have no idea what he meant by that. We've had no contact since, though I receive occasional postcards with no return address just to let me know he's still alive. In the decades since, the Holloway case has faded from academic attention, relegated to occasional mentions in obscure journals or as a footnote in broader studies of shared psychosis. The site of the Holloway Estate, long since reclaimed by the Ozark forests, bears no marker or memorial to the events that transpired there. County records indicate that the property was eventually sold for back taxes in 1943, but no development has ever been attempted on the land. Local folklore has preserved distorted versions of the story, typically casting it as a conventional haunting or attributing the family's madness to more mundane causes, such as mercury poisoning from the paint in the house or contamination of the well water. Few residents of Shannon County today are aware of the documented facts of the case or the strange phenomenon of the painting that drove an entire family to madness. A 1997 survey by the Missouri State Historical Society attempted to locate any physical remains of the Holloway mansion. The researchers found only the crumbling stone foundation and a portion of the chimney half buried in vegetation. Curiously, they noted in their report that despite the property having been abandoned for over 60 years, no significant tree growth has occurred within the footprint of the original structure. The surrounding forest encroaches to the very edge of the foundation, but does not cross it, creating an unnatural clearing that roughly corresponds to the dimensions of the house. Local forestry experts consulted regarding this phenomenon could offer no definitive explanation. Perhaps more telling is the experience reported by the survey team leader, Dr. Alan Matthews. In a personal blog post published several years after the official report, Matthews described an unsettling incident that occurred as the team was preparing to leave the site. "It was late afternoon and the light was beginning to fade," he wrote. "I was taking final photographs of the foundation when I noticed a peculiar quality to the sunlight filtering through the trees on the western edge of the clearing. It had taken on a yellowish cast that reminded me of old varnish and seemed to pull in the center of the foundation in a way that did not correspond to the actual angle of the sun." Matthews reported that as he watched, the light appeared to coalesce into a roughly rectangular shape that he initially mistook for reflection from his camera equipment. What struck me as odd was that the shape seemed to maintain its form, regardless of my movement or the changing conditions around it. For a brief moment, and I recognize how fanciful this sounds, I had the distinct impression that I was looking not at a play of light on the forest floor, but through a window, into somewhere else entirely. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to step into that light, an impulse so strong that one of my colleagues later told me he had called my name several times before I responded. The experience left Matthews with what he described as a persistent sense of incompleteness, as if I had glimpsed something significant, but failed to fully apprehend it. He reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams in the weeks following the survey, often featuring a seated figure whose face I could never quite see, no matter how I tried to focus on it. Perhaps this is for the best. As William Holloway wrote in his letter to Dr. Whitaker, "There are certain things that once seen cannot be unseen. The human mind is fragile, susceptible to influences we do not fully understand. The boundaries between perception and reality are more permeable than we care to admit. The story of the Holloway family and their painting serves as a reminder of these uncomfortable truths. It suggests that there may be configurations of light and shadow, of line and form, that can insinuate themselves into our consciousness in ways that defy rational explanation. It raises the disturbing possibility that art, typically viewed as a medium of expression and beauty, might sometimes become a vehicle for something else entirely, a doorway, as Richard Holloway feared, through which something alien might enter our world. In the quiet hills of the Ozarks, where the ruins of the Holloway Estate have long since been swallowed by the forest, perhaps something of that doorway still remains, not in physical form, but as a ripple in the fabric of reality, a subtle distortion, like the barely perceptible shift in perspective that Margaret Holloway described in that fateful painting. A reminder that there are aspects of our world that lie just beyond the edge of our understanding, waiting to be glimpsed from the corner of an eye, and, once glimpsed, never forgotten. In 2011, a doctoral student in art history at Washington University in St. Louis, conducting research on obscure American painters, discovered a reference to Victor Arnault in the archives of a small arts journal published in New Orleans in the 1880s. The article, a review of a private exhibition held in the home of a local patron, mentioned Arnault as an innovator in the field of perceptual art, creating works that, in the words of the artist himself, exist simultaneously in multiple frames of reference. The reviewer noted that Arnault's paintings, while technically proficient, were curiously unsettling to observe for any length of time and produced a peculiar sensation of vertigo in several guests. Awe. The doctoral student, intrigued by this description, attempted to locate other references to Arnault and his work, but found little beyond a brief obituary in a New Orleans newspaper noting his passing in 1891. However, she did discover a catalog from a 1967 exhibition at a small gallery in San Francisco titled Perspectives on Perception, Challenging the Viewer's Eye. Among the works listed was one identified as After Arnault, Artist Unknown, described as Oil on Canvas, depicting a seated figure by a window on loan from a private collection. The gallery, long since closed, left no records of who had loaned the painting or where it went after the exhibition. The doctoral student, following this thread as far as she could, eventually concluded that whatever remained of Arnault's work and legacy had been lost to time. Her dissertation focused on more well-documented artists, mentioned Arnault only in passing as an obscure figure deserving of further research. But perhaps some things are better left unresearched, some doors better left unopened. The Holloway case reminds us that not all knowledge brings enlightenment. Sometimes what we perceive as a window offering a new view of reality may, in fact, be something else entirely, a tear in the fabric of our understanding through which something watches and waits. As you sit now listening to this account, perhaps in the gathering darkness of your own room, consider this. Art is not always merely the creation of human hands and minds. Sometimes it may be a boundary, a membrane between what we know and what we cannot comprehend, and sometimes that membrane can wear thin. The next time you find yourself in a gallery or museum, standing before a painting that seems somehow different from those around it, a work that draws your eye and holds it for reasons you cannot quite articulate, ask yourself, am I looking at it or is it looking at me? And if the answer troubles you, perhaps it would be wise to simply walk away. For some visions once seen cannot be unseen. Some knowledge once gained cannot be forgotten. And some doors once opened, even a crack, can never be fully closed again. The Holloway family learned this truth at terrible cost. Their story echoes down through the decades as a warning to those who might peer too deeply into the shadows where the face should be. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Support us for more content like this.